Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Michaela Paukner, legal reporter with the Wisconsin Law Journal. I just launched a poll for everyone to answer. We're discussing two different topics today, COVID-19 and its impact on labor employment law, and then also some of the challenges surrounding the upcoming November election. So we're interested in seeing what you are most interested in hearing about and discussing today. So if you could take a couple seconds to answer the poll, that'll help us determine how we're going to split the time today. I also would encourage everyone to submit their questions at any point during today's discussion about either topic, and we will answer as many as we can get to. So without further ado, my guest today is attorney Richard Sachs of Hawks Quindell. He represents individuals and groups in a variety of employment and civil rights claims. His clients include labor unions and other social justice organizations engaged in legal battles to defend and advance the living standards and civil rights of working people. Today, like I said, he's here to talk to us about labor and employment law and COVID-19's impact, as well as some of the legal issues surrounding the upcoming election. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I want to start out by talking about, now that we're about 6 months into the pandemic, and what does the current landscape look like for labor and employment law?
You want me to answer that, Michaela?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thank you for inviting me. Hello, everybody. As Michaela said, I practice labor and employment law and also election law in my practice. And this has been a very trying time for workers, as well as people who are involved in elections in terms of trying to mobilize voters to come out and vote, despite some of the obstacles that they face. But let's get first into what the general landscape has been since the pandemic became official on March 11th. Essentially, Congress responded by passing two major pieces of legislation back in March that have really kind of shaped the landscape. The first law was the CARES Act, which is the coronavirus, that's an acronym for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And what that law was intended to do was basically to provide some economic stimulus to the economy so we wouldn't plunge into a depression. And it provided a lot of small business loans. It provided tax credits to employers who would opt to try to retain their employees during COVID slowdowns, shutdowns of businesses. And it also provided expansion of unemployment insurance benefits from 26 weeks to 39 weeks, plus also provided a additional payment of $600, which has subsequently been, with that $600 payment expired, and by a memorandum, President Trump basically extended that through the end of the year to $400, but it's really $300 because it accounted for $100 from the states, which they're not going to do. So, and it expanded the bases and reasons by which employees could get unemployment insurance. It expanded it to independent contractors. And it also provided money to companies and to basically provide new, basically protective equipment, personal protective equipment for their employees, to cover leave payments and things like that. For example, in Milwaukee area transit companies, for example, received about $62 million in CARES Act funding for things like that. So, you know, it was an important act by Congress. The other really important piece of legislation that passed that relates to employment was what's called the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or the FFCRA. And the purpose of that really was to expand the provisions in the Family Medical Leave Act to allow for 2 weeks of paid sick leave for pretty much all employees who had at least 30 days with an employer for a whole host of reasons related to the pandemic. There are 6 criteria that are basically covered, but significantly, it also provided for 10 additional weeks of paid leave for employees who had to stay home and care for a child whose school was closed or whose childcare center was closed. So those were the 2 main pieces of legislation. President Trump just issued another memorandum, which could be problematic and troublesome for employees, where he did it via a presidential memo. I'm not certain of the legal authority for doing that, but he did it. And basically what it allowed employers to defer the payment of the payroll taxes for employees. And ostensibly that was intended to assist employees, but I mean, there's a somewhat serious concern that some employers may not pay it at the end or may go out of business before the end of the year. And it could result in some liabilities for employees or failure to receive those benefits. So those are the main, the 2 main laws that have passed. I mean, there are other laws that I would say affect the landscape in terms of the pandemic. One of them is the handicap discrimination laws, the Americans with Disability Act, which protects employees in terms of from discrimination from a disability or a perceived disability, which COVID-19 is. And then the second is, and on the other hand, the flip side, it also allows employers to take steps to prevent employees that they believe might be infected with COVID from actually coming to work, that they're not necessarily fit for duty. The ADA allows employers to do that. The other issue that's arisen legally is this issue of employer immunity. There's a sweeping Republican bill that Mitch McConnell has been pushing that basically seeks to immunize employers from any liability for anything related to COVID. I believe that bill is basically it's a straw man. It's not something that's required. Employers really are not facing substantial liability for injuries or diseases or deaths that employees incur as a result of exposure to the virus while at work. The workers' comp exclusivity provision makes workers' comp the only remedy available for employees who contract COVID at work. So, and as folks know, workers' comp is statutory and it excludes any kind of compensatory or punitive damages and just sets fairly minimal damages for employees. It's an important, workers' comp is very important, but the benefits that employees get under it are pretty much just wage replacement. So for example, even in a death case, the maximum in Wisconsin a worker can get for death from COVID, for example, would be 4 times their salary. So if a worker made $30,000 in a year, the most their family would get would be $120,000, which is a pretty, a significant amount of money for them, but it's not a serious award of benefits that's really going to replace the loss that family had. So, that's basically the landscape that we've had.
Okay, and I want to go into a little bit more about each of these bills. So first, with the one you just mentioned that the Republicans are supporting, if it doesn't sound like it does, it won't, you said it's like a straw man. So why support it and why take this stance that they want employer immunity?
I've raised that question to a lot of people and all I get is blank stares as to why they're pushing it so strongly. I don't understand it. The only thing I can think of is that it's, they're doing it for political reasons, just to try to, rally, their base and their supporters. I don't understand it. I mean, they're and it doesn't make any sense. There's no spate of lawsuit. There have been some lawsuits that have been filed but basically they're all going to be, most of them are going to be dismissed because, the exclusive remedy for workers who get injured in the workplace by contracting COVID-19 is through workers' compensation. So in my view, it's really much ado about nothing. I don't get it. I have yet to see any case or any lawsuit where a worker has won significant damage awards in a personal injury style lawsuit for contracting COVID-19. So I don't get it. And I think that's part of the reason why, they're making some publicity about it, but they're not really pushing it hard or seriously. Although it gets a lot of publicity, but it's really kind of it is a straw man, totally.
Okay. And in terms of the things that have passed, the CARES Act and the FFCRA, when you're thinking about how your clients are affected by these bills, these laws, how are they enough, or what does that impact look like for your clients?
Well, I mean, they're not, no, I mean, this was really a stop. These two pieces of legislation were really stopgap measures to try to keep some money in the pockets of workers so that our country wouldn't plunge into a depression. It really didn't take any real serious steps to guarantee or ensure that workers were assured a safe workplace. There's been no legislation that's been passed to guarantee that. The only law that workers have been able to rely upon during this entire pandemic are really two. I mean, well, the ADA is one, but that has not really, in my experience, been invoked extensively. But OSHA, which does have a provision in it that requires employers to provide a safe workplace, and OSHA is a federal administrative agency charged with enforcing that law. There's no private cause of action for a worker under OSHA. The only remedy basically is to go to OSHA, to go to the Department of Labor, and ask them to come and inspect the workplace and try to enforce some safe provisions. OSHA was very slow to move when the pandemic started, especially when the meatpacking industry was really hard hit back in April and May by the spread of COVID-19 throughout meatpacking and food processing plants. And I think OSHA got about over 70 complaints before they even went and did a single inspection. I will say, once they've gone out and done inspections in some places, in some of the meatpacking plants, they have compelled employers to take some minimal steps, such as, insisting that workers not work so closely together, creating some physical barriers between the workers on meatpacking assembly lines, and also requiring employers to provide personal protective equipment like masks and the like, and to institute some kind of testing and screening measures so that infected employees don't come to work. But it took a long time. I mean, it took a really long time for OSHA to begin, and their resources are minimal, and I don't think anything's been done to really beef up OSHA to really protect workers, to respond to guarantee their safety during this pandemic.
That's unfortunate to hear, especially you and I had talked about some of the people who are in these positions just simply don't have the means to be able to stay home and protect their families.
Right. I mean, I just would add one more thing. The other law that ostensibly would protect employees would be the National Labor Relations Act, where workers could, if they acted together in concert to try to affect and insist upon safe working conditions, that would be considered protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act, for which the employees could not be disciplined, retaliated against. And it's actually very unfortunate that the National Labor Relations, the NLRB, which is the administrative agency charged with enforcing the National Labor Relations Act, has basically not done very much with complaints that have been filed about NLRA violations related to the pandemic. And the Washington office of the National Labor Relations Board has actually directed all the regions to send all the cases to what they call advice, which is basically allowing the federal, the agency in Washington to determine how to deal with those cases. And a lot of those cases are just dying on the vine, and they're just sitting there in the NLRB's advice section. So that's an unfortunate thing.
Definitely. And I want to switch gears now because our poll results showed that most people are here for both the employment and labor and election law. So I want to start talking about some of the election law issues. And we're exactly 2 months away from the November 3rd election today. And in the last month, we've seen Wisconsin join in a lawsuit over changes to the U.S. Postal Service that could undermine mail-in voting. So what issues do you expect the federal court to decide? And are these issues going to be figured out before 2 months from now when we're having the election?
Yeah, well, as I said, the amount of litigation around employment law with respect to COVID-19 is pretty minimal. But when we get into the area of election law, there are over, I think there's somebody, I read some blogger at Loyola Law School who's tracking this, said that there was over about 200 cases that are pending before primarily federal district courts over voting issues for the election. The case that you cited, the lawsuit that was filed by a number of states, which Wisconsin joined, challenging General Postmaster DeJoy's changes, it really is now mooted out because he's said that he's not going to go through with all those changes, with all those cuts that he talked about in terms of the processing machines and the mailboxes and their hours. But the battle over the November 3rd election is playing out in 43 different states involving lawsuits over a host of issues, which primarily relate to a few issues. One, the most important one, is probably the question of whether or not statutory requirements for the return of absentee ballots by election day will be insisted upon, will remain in place, or whether those will be relaxed to allow for the return of ballots, absentee ballots that are completed and sent before the election, but don't get to the clerk until several days after the election. And that's, as we know, the post office is, as we learned in our own April 7th election, absentee ballots were slow to be returned. They took, in many cases, weeks at a time. So that's a crucial issue. And that issue is playing out in many states in terms of whether or not the statutory deadline for the return of absentee ballots will be relaxed. The other issue that, and these are all state issues because, while there is a federal right to vote, the implementation of elections and how elections occur is purely a matter governed by state law. So these are all playing out state by state. The other issue is over signature requirements on the absentee ballots, and also signature requirement and also witness requirements on the absentee ballots. And that's something that is being challenged mostly by voting rights advocates. The other issue that's coming into play is whether or not you can use, the Republicans call it vote harvesting, voting rights groups and Democrats call it basically ballot collection and creating drop boxes where people can return their absentee ballots. Like here in Milwaukee, the Election Commission just purchased and they're setting up 15 steel boxes for ballots to be collected at libraries where people can avoid having to deposit the absentee ballot into a mailbox and worry about whether or not the U.S. Postal Service is going to deliver it, and instead just drop it into a ballot collection box that's maintained by the clerk, and so that people can ensure that it's delivered on time. So that's a big issue. The other big issue which is really playing out only in one state, in Florida, is the issue of felon enfranchisement, or felon disenfranchisement. As folks know, I believe in 2018, Florida passed a ballot initiative which removed the constitutional requirement that felons couldn't vote. And after that was passed, the Florida legislature then passed a law which basically said, well, yes, we understand, okay, we recognize that the constitutional law prohibition has been changed, has been dropped, but we are going to insist that any felon who, in order to vote, has to pay the fine that was imposed, or the fees that were imposed upon them when they were sentenced. And if they don't pay it, then they can't vote. That affects over 700,000 voters in the state of Florida. And a U.S. District Court judge, the case was Jones v. DeSantis, a U.S. District Court judge in Florida invalidated that basically poll tax for former felons. And now it's up before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and they're likely going to decide that in September. And that issue could be determinative, certainly, in the state of Florida. So those are some of the key issues that we're seeing. The other issue is the mailing out of ballot applications, which, as folks know, here in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Election Commission, I think, 2 days ago, started sending out ballot applications to all voters. And in certain places, I know President Trump has challenged has challenged sending those. I just want to say one more thing. I know we're running short of time, but President Trump keeps talking about fraud with respect to mail-in voting, and there's absolutely no history of fraud. And when he talks about, all we're talking about in mail-in voting is absentee balloting. And we've had absentee balloting for years in many, many states. This election is going to be different. This election, there's expanded mail-in voting in many, many states. There's actually 11 states that are going to be allowed to actually have their ballots, not the absentee ballot application, have their ballots mailed out to them. They're anticipating about 80 million voters that are going to cast their ballots by mail in this election. So it's going to be fascinating. And there are 12 states, many of them, 4 of them, key battleground states, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that don't count their absentee ballots the night they can't start counting until after the polls are closed on election day. And those places are going to have to wait to count those ballots to see if what the election results are. And some folks have said that it's a good chance that President Trump could disregard those states and just declare a victory on election night, which could create a real problem.
Yeah, in an election year that's already very heated, we have so many issues to overcome as well in terms of the actual logistics of it. Right. And legally, of those key issues you mentioned, legally, does Wisconsin have current lawsuits challenging or asking about those issues right now? And if so, where do those stand?
Yes, there is litigation before Judge Connolly in the Western District of Wisconsin. There are 4 different lawsuits that are they're seeking various things, but the primary one is an extension of the absentee ballot return deadline, similar to what Judge Connolly granted for the April 7th election. And those cases have been briefed, and they're just awaiting Judge Connolly's decision. There's some other measures that folks have asked for. I would say the including relating to the signature requirements and registration deadlines. But the primary issue is the return of the absentee ballots and whether they have to be counted, whether they have to be in by election day or not. So that case, that's an important case. And from my perspective, hopefully Judge Connolly rules the same way he ruled for the April 7th election.
And what do you think the timeline is for resolution for that case?
But he should come up hopefully soon. Hopefully it'll be within the next week or so. The briefing's been done. So my sense is within the next 10 days, we should see a decision from Judge Conley. I would think he wants, he doesn't want to spring anything on anybody. And he's been through this already before with the April 7th election. And that was a significant remedial measure that Judge Conley imposed for the April 7th election by allowing folks until April 13th to have their absentee ballots returned. They still had to be postmarked. That was a requirement that the U.S. Supreme Court insisted upon. It resulted in 79,000 additional ballots, voters being able to vote. In other words, there were 79,000 voters whose ballots were postmarked by Election Day, but not returned until April 13th. And those were 79,000 additional votes, which is a lot of votes. That's more than the margin of victory in the presidential election in 2016. So it's an important issue, very important issue.
Definitely. Is there any indication of how Judge Conley is going to rule at this point?
I mean, my guess is, given some of the delays with the post office and all the issues that they've been, that have been in the media about how, the delays they've had in instances around the country as well, where bunches, whole stacks of ballots, absentee ballots have been found just sitting in post offices. I do think, and he did it once before, he did it in April 7th. I think it's likely he'll allow for a relaxed return deadline for the absentee ballots again. I think that's likely.
Okay. And in our last couple of minutes here, I just want to put out one last call for anybody to submit any questions they have. And then, Rich, I want to ask you, are there any other things that you want to talk about here as we're waiting to see if anybody has their own questions?
I would just say that I think that the pandemic may have really changed in many ways the ways in which politics is conducted in terms of less reliance on in-person visits to people's homes, but also most important is I think this may be a permanent switch that we see in politics, in the electoral process, whereby there's greater reliance upon the use of mail-in and absentee balloting. Typically in Wisconsin, for example, it's only about 15% of the voters have traditionally voted by absentee ballots in past elections. In the April 7th election, there was close to 70% of the people voted by way of absentee, and I think that's going to continue. And I think once people get familiar with it, it's going to be a popular way to vote. I would point out that it was, historically, absentee balloting was something that was used more in greater numbers by white voters and wealthier voters than poor voters and minority voters. And that was also the case on April 7th. But I think now, with the efforts to try to mail out the absentee ballot applications to everybody, I think you're going to see a strong reliance upon mail-in absentee balloting by all voters. And this could be a permanent feature, characteristic of the election process in Wisconsin as well as other states.
We did get one question here that someone is saying that a relaxed deadline to submit ballots could lead to voter fraud, and they're asking what is wrong with a voter ID law.
Well, voter ID law is different. I mean, there is a voter ID requirement. I mean, we did ask Judge Conley in the April 7th to relax or even waive the photo ID requirement, and he refused to do it, and Seventh Circuit upheld that. And so that's one. I mean, that's a separate issue. But there's no evidence at all that mail-in balloting is susceptible or has been used to perpetrate voter fraud in any way. It's simply a myth that President Trump is trying to promote, but there's zero evidence for that at all. So I would say that there's no reason to be concerned that the increased reliance upon mail-in absentee balloting is going to result in any kind of fraud. Wisconsin's never counted their absentee ballots before the close of polls on election day anyway. So they always waited until polls were closed to start counting ballots, the absentee ballots. So this is just giving people this. So it's nothing different that's happening, really. We're just expanding the return deadline. And it's not going to influence how anybody votes, because we're not going to see, because folks have to have the ballots in by election day. So it's not as if knowing the results or how the in-person balloting went is going to impact anybody who votes by mail-in absentee ballot. So there's no evidence of it. It's just simply, it's a total ruse.
Thanks for your insight in answering that question. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So once again, I want to thank you for your time today. And then everybody else, I just want to let you know who's watching. I want to let you know what we have coming up for the Law Journal's webinar series. Next week, we have attorney Jason Cahoot, partner at Foley and Lardner. He's also talking about election-related issues, and he'll be focused on political contributions and guidelines for making those as an individual and as an organization, as well as tips with making the most of your contribution to make lasting policy change. And then if you have any ideas for speakers and topics you'd like to see for future webinars, please send me an email. My information is here. And then if you'd like to get involved on a sponsorship level, please contact Jenny Byington. Her email is here as well. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope that you have a great rest of the week.